Okay, well, I'm here with Ari Nazim, and we are just having a conversation, and we decided to record it to talk about Ari's map or vision or model that involves temples. And I believe we're going to talk about specifically the fifth temple. But do you want to briefly give an overview as to what the temples are, and then we can dive into the juicy bits?
Absolutely. Yeah, first of all, this is just so funny and exciting. We were just in a call and then I was like, all right, let's just record a podcast. So I love it. And I've been meaning to put something out about the fifth temple and that framing um, for about a month now. So I'm really glad getting the chance to do this. And thank you, Tucker, for instigating. Um, yeah, the idea with the temples is that um, we've been the same biological organism for at least the last 50,000 years. We've been behaviorally modern for that time. But the way that we've organized ourselves um, as humans on the planet has gone through distinct stages of evolution. So if you've heard me talk before, I often talk about how our bodies have gone through seven stages of biological evolution, from cells that turn into fish, that turn into reptiles, that turn into mammals, that turn into primates, that turn into early humans, and then modern humans. And I have some other videos and things where I discuss that progression of biological evolution and the capacities that come online throughout biological evolution. So, the drives, the evolutionary drives, like for survival, for pleasure, for esteem, for intimacy, etc., and the intelligences that come online, kinesthetic intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, practical intelligence, etc. The idea with the temples is that the temples are basically um, perspectives, new mindsets that reorient our relationship to biology. So every human being has all seven intelligences, all seven drives, an access to a variety of different archetypes, etc. But throughout human history, we have organized those differently. And the temples are the evolution of those different, I guess, mindsets or worldviews of how we've used our bodies and how we've related to each other. So there have been in the different temples, different prioritizations of intelligences, different prioritizations of types, etc. So before the first temples, we were in the natural state, the state that any human being would be in if they never went to school or were taught, algebra or taught how money works or whatever it is, the way that humans biologically organize. In the same way you can look at a sparrow or a snake and you would say they have behaviors that are indicative of this species of snake. We are also biological organisms, and we have behaviors that are indicative of our biology, which is we form tribal bands, nomadic tribal bands. We sing a lot, we dance a lot, we are animist naturally. That's not like a thing human beings learn. Human beings are animist. This is my perspective. If you don't teach a child that Santa Claus isn't real, the child will believe in Santa Claus, right? If you don't teach the child that trees don't have spirits, they will go on thinking trees can talk to them and have spirits. Human beings have an animist disposition naturally. That is part of I would argue, our biological classification as Homo sapiens. We see spirit in the world naturally. So I don't consider that one of the temples, also because they didn't build temples. They don't build strong or enduring material culture, it doesn't seem like, because they are living in a more, I guess, integrated regenerative way with the natural environment. And so in certain integral frameworks, there's like this purple category or beige category, this idea that like that the indigenous state is like its own state of consciousness that then gets like quickly transcended in a very linear way by the first I guess civilizational uh perspective, which they call red, or they call, the polytheist view, what I call the first temple. But I would actually argue it's actually a really different thing is happening when you go from the basic indigenous state into the first temples. It's not just like a very linear, like one perspective to the next thing. It's a very drastic change. You're going from a state of wholeness, like a biological state of wholeness, kind of the human being as a biological organism living in a relationship, in a whole integrated relationship with their natural environment. And as we transition into the the stages of cultural evolution, there's actually a big falling, almost like the Garden of Eden sort of thing, which is, I think, kind of what that myth is mentioning. There's actually like a big fragmentation that's happening as we step away from nature and become cultural beings. There is an actual transformation that's happening that where there's a lot that we lose in that. So it's not just like a one-to-one thing between the before the first temple and the first temple. So that's just something I want to note. That's something that in the integral lineage is not very well discussed. They often talk about, oh, it's this really actually like linear progression from indigenous to civilization. I think it's actually a pretty big change. So that's before the first temple. I call that the basic state or kind of the natural kind of human orientation. The first temples were built when human beings started to settle in one place and they started to do agriculture and they built temples usually to worship a variety of deities, a pantheon of deities. So the first temple, in a word, is polytheism. It's the recognition that there are powerful archetypical forces that rule the world, and we want to be in right relationship with those archetypical forces to get what we specifically want. It's not just to be in harmony with nature or to live, in our kind of way. It's so that we can win in war against another kingdom, right? So I'm going to pray to the god of war and sacrifice things to the god of war to win in war against these people. Or I'm going to pray to the god of medicine to do this healing task. And it's not about the will or surrendering to the will of the creator, but it's actually trying to change things. And there's an ego, there's the understanding of an ego, there's kind of this first person perspective that's in it as well, of like, I have things that I want to do, I'm gonna do whatever opportunistically I need to do to make that happen. And what that looks like for them is having this pantheon of deities for the different things that they want to do and sacrificing things or doing the right rites to appease that deity to make the thing happen. And this was the dominant, mindset all around the planet during the time of early agriculture. So you can look at the Mayan pantheon. They have a whole pantheon of deities that they're doing these rituals with. You can look at the Greek pantheon. You can look at the Egyptian pantheon. You can look at the Roman pantheon, the Norse pantheon. These are all first temples. And there's usually multiple of them, and it's usually a polytheist organization. Um, this beats hunter-gatherer tribes in warfare. This mode, it in warfare historically defeated hunter-gatherer tribes. That doesn't mean it's better than hunter-gatherer tribes. It just won in warfare, which is how we tell history. The same thing happened with monotheism and against polytheism. So monotheism is what I would call the second temple, and monotheism is the idea that okay, there's a bunch of these like kingdoms with their own gods, and the kings of those kingdoms usually think that they're part of the gods or something like this, but these guys are fighting all the time and making life really shitty for the majority of people on the planet, the peasants and the townspeople. It's like these king egos are fighting each other and making everything kind of suck for the majority of people. And so there's a point where the mass of people gets to um, I guess a majority where there's a story that indigenously rises out of them, which is the idea that there's a God that's not out of this world, right? And this is the thing that's consistent across the various second temples, whether it be Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, in its kind of early axial age stage, is the idea that there is a transcendent reality not of this world. And there was a God or a force, there was a way, a moral way that transcendent reality is organized, and there is some messenger that has come to us and conveyed to us how to be in alignment with that transcendent reality. So the earth is sinful, it's hellish, it's unending suffering, it's a cycle that you can never really escape from. And we're trying to follow the word of the prophet and follow the book that the prophet has given us, the code the prophet has given us that allows us to be capital G good people and have us go to heaven or paradise or nirvana or whatever it is that's transcendent away from this world. And this is a much bigger story than these are our local deities of this place or of these cities. and I'm going to pray to that deity to help me to fight this other city. It's like a really, really big story about how the universe was created, our place in it, and there is a strong moral code that applies to everyone. And this is also aligned with the second person perspective of being realizing that you can be seen by other people and that you're in a culture and that actually your own ego needs to be regulated by kind of the cultural communal perspective so that you can be a good person and survive in a larger community of not just people you know and people you've grown up around, but a ton of people. That's what the Second Temple helps with too, is organizing tons of people. And you need a story that's so big to organize a civilization that's happening across many cities. As polytheism works when you don't have cities that are that big and a population that's that big, but when you have like, a whole 20 mega cities that are connected. You need these really big stories so that the individual kings don't fight each other and everyone can say, oh, it's for the good of, God. And I think they were having genuine spiritual experiences. I'm not discounting that, but they were interpreting it through a specific lens, which is a moralistic sky father God. So the first temple is polytheism. The second temple is monotheism. Um, that was, monotheism was kind of the dominant temple, dominant cultural structure on the planet for 2,000 years, at least 1,000 intense years. And then that started to become challenged in during the Enlightenment. So only around like 500, 600 years ago, you have kind of this new type of prophet emerge who is saying, actually, there's not just one prophet that came, like Jesus, who's bringing us the book, who we just need to live by the book and we're going to go to heaven forever, which is some transcendent place. We're growing prophets all the time in universities. And someone like Newton, someone like Darwin, these people are finding new things out about the nature of reality um, that are teaching us how the universe actually works from an objective third person perspective, right? From an looking, so first person is just my perspective. Second person is looking at the dynamic between me and someone else or someone else's perspective looking at me. And then third person perspective would be looking at those two dynamics from an objective standpoint. This is the introduction of rationality or objectivity and much less of a focus on the subjective experience, which was a big part of the first temple and the second temple. Now we're thinking a lot about the objective, rational world, the material world, and understanding basically trying to the new myth is a myth of progress and like we were dumb then, we're smarter now, we're getting smarter all the time. As we get smarter, we learn more things about how the world works. As we learn new things about how the world works, we can build technologies, build solutions based on those things, and we can build heaven on earth here and now. We don't need to wait for some transcendent tomorrow. We don't need to follow the rules of some moralistic God. If we understand how nature works, nature being physics and chemistry and biology, etc., we can create heaven on earth now and live in material abundance now. And there's no evidence to support this idea of a transcendent God. We're not interested in subjective experience where that evidence comes from. And we want to have objectively efficient lives in the material world. This is what we call modernism or modernity. This is the mindset that emerges with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And it's also the mindset that resulted in things like democracy and the structures of the United States, things like this, equal right, or I guess human rights at the large level. This is called orange and spiral dynamics. And I call it the third temple. Modernity is the third temple. It's the temple that is still the strongest in Western culture. It's kind of the mainstream Western culture has a large kind of third temple thing. And it might be strange to hear science and modernity being talked about in the temple language, but I think it's important to talk about it that way because it puts it in the lineage of ways that humans have made meaning. And we do the third temple does have literal temples, which are universities and factories and scientific laboratories and cars are implements of the third temple. And seeing it that way and seeing the third temple as having prophets like Newton and Darwin and Neil deGrasse Tyson, I think actually makes more sense in the context of humanity as a larger phenomena, right? Like if we really zoom out, it's the same thing happening again, just with a radically different perspective, but it is a religious structure in the sense that it's providing meaning for people. It has a story about how the universe came to be and where it's going to go. It has a moralistic component of how you should live your life, given the fact that you're a, you know, um, biological organism that is going to die in 100 years. And so might as well have heaven on earth now, right? So that's modernity. That's the third temple. The fourth temple comes about when the third temple has kind of is starting to fold in on itself. And I really think of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima as being kind of the seed of the fourth temple coming down from the sky and hitting planet Earth. Because the atomic bomb is the moment where we realize, wait, maybe technology isn't the answer to all of our problems. Maybe just knowing how to manipulate the physical world isn't enough on its own, right? Maybe that will actually cause the destruction of everything. And maybe there are other perspectives that are important to bring to the conversation besides just efficiency and progress and technological development, right? Um, it's also helped along by the emergence of the fourth temple was also helped along by mass media through television because you can see other people in other parts of the world and see that they're similar to you and have cultures that are similar to you and maybe there's some value there. Um, globalization with the introduction of the plane and immigration that happened as a result of the Second World War. There's a lot of cultural mixing that starts to happen on a really large scale. And this requires a new worldview to be able to process this. We call this the fourth person perspective, or the ability to reflect on objective perspectives. And you get a lot of philosophers and artists questioning the concept of an objective truth. Is there really an objective truth, or are we um, co-creating what we think to be objective through our perspective? Right? There's critiques of science that are coming out. There are also new advancements in science like quantum physics that are showing that the observer alters reality and this is having effects. And we're basically the fourth temple believes that every perspective has some amount of validity and trying to create some huge narrative is doing violence to a lot of perspectives by saying, oh, it's a myth of progress. It's saying, well, what about all the amazing things that have emerged before? What about all the other cultures that have already emerged and the wisdom and medicine that they have? So the fourth temple is what we call pluralism or relativism. It's saying that, everything has something to offer, but you can't organize those into a hierarchical structure. And it's these hierarchical structures that have been hurting us and fucking us up. And we want to just have a really big table where everyone can say their piece and we can start to coexist. And this is where you get, like the coexist bumper sticker, right? It's like all these different perspectives there together, but it's not necessarily synthesizing into anything. So the fourth temple is the temple of, Woodstock and peace and love. And it brings about the ecological movement and the civil rights movement and um, the vegan movement, vegetarian movement, etc. So the fourth temple, the hippie movement, all that. So the fourth temple is called green in spiral dynamics, and it's associated with the fourth person perspective. And it's only now, I guess, in some ways gaining insane mainstream coverage, but it started to emerge, even as early as the late 1800s with people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau and Walt Whitman. But, it came into much bigger public consciousness after the Second World War because more people became aware of the fact that the Third Temple and modernity was having problems. And of course, it now is integrated into culture. You can go to Spirit Halloween and buy a hippie costume, and there are so many things that would have been thought as hippie that are just a part of our daily life, like the fact that we recycle or, um, you know, think about organic foods and things like this. These were radical things in the 70s or 50s. Now these are part of everyday culture. So the Fourth Temple has been to some degree integrated. Um, and this brings us to the Fifth Temple, which is the issue with the fourth temple is becoming more and more evident over the last 10, 20 years. There are people even like Wilbur writing about the issues with postmodernism maybe as early as the 80s or the 90s. And there are other thinkers that have been thinking about what comes after postmodernism. um, the issue with the fourth temple is that it's really hard for the fourth temple to do things, and that when you're looking at all the perspectives, it's hard to prioritize one over another. And it's hard to say, okay, we should do this before that, or this is more important than that. It's you're when you're coming into a fourth person perspective or coming into kind of, I guess, the fourth temple culture and fourth temple worldview, you're just trying to get familiar with um, making space for making space for perspectives that have been marginalized, have been excluded. And so there's a whole lot of work that just needs to happen with getting those voices as a part of the conversation, getting, women to be balanced in conversations, bringing in the perspectives of people of color, bringing in indigenous perspectives, bringing in ecological perspectives. It takes a while to just get these perspectives at the table and actually have a voice. But once you have them at the table, there's a question of, now that we respect these perspectives, we hold these perspectives, where do we go? And we need a big story or a new story that can unify us, so that we can move forward, because we're facing crises on the planet at the moment, sometimes called the meta crisis, poly crisis, sometimes called the meaning crisis, which is the idea that we have existential level risks that no one nation can solve, no one person can solve. We need everyone on the planet to come together to solve some of these things, like climate change, um, or some of the new threats that may be emerging with AI or nanotech or whatever it is. We need full species coordination and cooperation to be able to meet some of these problems, and we can't do that from a place where everyone's perspective has equal value. Um, and so what's emerging is a fifth person perspective, or the fifth temple, metamodernism, which comes after postmodernism, which is the idea of basically integrating all of these perspectives into a holistic worldview that's evolving over time. And one of the quick ways that I like to talk about it is that each of the previous temples are either or temples. So it's either, my pantheon of gods, or my city versus your city, right? Then the second temple would be, my God versus sinners or non-believers, right? Like there's people who are with the one true God, or there's people who are just, not with it and are going to go to hell and are, not holy people. Then in the third temple, it's, people who are innovating and moving forward and are with the times and with progress, or there are people who are stuck in the past. With the fourth temple, there are people who are inclusive, or people who are tolerant, or people who are bigoted and regressive and sexist, racist, homophobic, etc. So each of these have kind of an either or. And the fifth temple is the first one that's both and. So it says each of these perspectives have something that we want to learn from, and they're not the sum total of all truth. So each of these previous perspectives that has emerged is something that we want to hold and work with. And we're open to new perspectives emerging. We're open to a synthesis of these perspectives. We're open to the process continuing to develop and not getting stuck in any one of these worldviews, which is sometimes in spiral dynamics why they call it flex flow. So the ability to flex and flow between different perspectives and hold these different perspectives contextually at different times. And the fifth temple is also very much based on a uh, developmental view. So modernity has a developmental view, but it's the developmental view of technological progress, right? And it's that we are increasing our technological capacity over time. The fourth temple kind of critiques the developmental view and says, or the progressive view, the myth of progress, and it says, progress has been used to oppress people and say some people are higher or lower, and this has caused a lot of problems. So it kind of does away with this idea of a teleology, or a direction to evolution, or a direction to the universe. Whereas the fifth temple brings this back, and it says, well, there's a difference between um, growth hierarchies and dominator hierarchies. And if we look at nature, nature seems to be made in this layered way, right? From quarks to atoms to cells to organisms. There are these layers of being that emerge, and it seems like what the universe is doing is creating more and more complexity. And there's a whole field of complexity science that is studying this. And the fifth temple is based on this idea that evolution does have a direction, it does have a teleology, and that teleology is complexity, and complexity is correlated with the increase in consciousness. And so it's not that the arc of history is towards just technological development. It's actually towards the development of depth and of consciousness. And that's what the process of cultural evolution that I've outlined in these five temples, that is what we're describing, is increasing levels of depth, increasing levels of perspective, and you can look at, the whole stack going up through the levels of biological evolution, through the levels of cultural evolution, kind of culminating in the fifth temple, and of course, whatever emerges beyond it. That is a story of increasing depth, increasing complexity, increasing consciousness. And the fifth temple aims to be in service to this emerging thing. And it's the first temple also that's probably going to compost itself constantly into whatever comes next. So the previous temples are really fighting the emergence. So polytheism is fighting the emergence of monotheism. Monotheism is fighting the emergence of modernity. Modernity is fighting the emergence of postmodernity. Postmodernity is fighting the emergence of metamodernity. But metamodernity, integral, fifth temple, fifth person perspective is the first one that is aware of the developmental process, aware that it has actually gone through these transitions before and is open to it happening again and actually happening in this moment now, constantly, even on a small scale. And so it's the first one that's really open to the process of change, radical change and emergence. And so sometimes the symbol I use for the fifth temple is like an upside down question mark, which kind of looks like a five, because we are still figuring out what it is ourselves. And we're still sensing into what is trying to emerge through us and what this new culture looks like. And we're very much at the beginning of it. So that's my little spiel.
That was very, very fantastically articulate overview. Good job. Um, I'm curious, you spoke about the third temple churches as being, the factory and the scientific lab and the university, or I don't know if you said that. What would you say are the fourth temple churches and yeah, the places where they're really that the religion of the fourth temple is really shining bright? And then what would you hypothesize or envision or intuit as what fifth temple uh, churches would be or
Yeah, I
are?
love it. Yeah, the first thing I would say is what I guess I mean by church is in a really loose sense of being a way in which the values and um, the meaning of life that the temple is proclaiming is basically experienced and practiced, right? So in a Christian church and the second temple, they're saying, the meaning of life is following the word of God in the Bible, and we're trying to, live in accordance with that. So you go to church to learn the word of the Bible, to learn how to be a good Christian, to kind of confess anything that's come up, to stay in right relationship to that story of meaning. That's what church is in the way that we normally use the word church. In the third temple, you know, the narrative is that um, we are basically trying to constantly learn more about the true nature of things and objective reality, and to harness that true nature of things for material success and development on the planet. And so you need to go to university to learn those things, and you need to be educated in the objective facts that these previous, modern prophets have learned, and you need to be educated essentially, right? Um, and also, there's the market and stuff. So, you got to consume and you got to buy the newest technology and be a part of this technological unfolding and be with the times, blah, blah, blah. The fourth temple, it's churches, the classic one I use is the music festival, because it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't have a purpose. You're not coming together and singing a song together or coming to have some sort of specific intentional transformation of consciousness occur or something. Um, you're you're going there to have a good time and basically, revel in the sound and fury of it not necessarily needing to have a point, and just it being in this aesthetic experience that can just be good for its own sake. I mean, one of the great dignities the fourth temple has given us is being able to appreciate something for its own sake. Like throughout history, art has been, for a purpose. Like in ancient Egypt, they weren't making art for fun. They wouldn't even consider the stuff they were making art. Now we put it in like an art museum and we're like, wow, Egyptian art. It's like those were sacred, ritual, religious objects that helped the state maintain power over the populace, right? And they were made by artisans who were trained for that purpose. Um, Most of Western art is religious art from the Second Temple. And why would I paint a scene of something happening in my daily life when I paint the thing that really matters, which is the transcendent, stories from the Bible or a picture of Madonna and Child? That's real art. Why would I paint something of the flesh that is sinful and is decaying anyways? The third temple, you know, there there's a lot of obsession around making things that are as realistic as possible and representing objective reality as close as they can. And you get people painting scenes of daily life and realism and trying to be as accurate with their painting as possible to what's actually happening, painting still lifes and stuff like this. In the fourth temple, it's like why can't it just be pretty? And so you get things like, modern art and Jeff Koons balloon animal or something like this. That's the whole point. The point is the surface of it, right? The point is just the aesthetic. And so that's a lot of what you see in the fourth temple is just experiences for their own sake. And music festivals are a good example of that. Like you're not going there to a lot of people, or at least the narrative is that you're not going there to learn something. You're just going there to have fun and to experience this aesthetic thing for its own sake. Um, Sometimes I think like the Museum of Ice Cream is a great example. If you remember that, it's like the place with like the ball pits and like the mirrors where like people go to take like Instagram photos that are really aesthetic. It's like it doesn't mean anything. It's just like a ball pit, and that's kind of interesting to look at and like have that experience. I think brands, people have a really strong allegiance to brands as being like, I guess maybe that's a little bit of the third temple too, but um, there's like this whole identity thing of I get to express myself through the things that I consume and the things that I buy and the way that I make myself look. So the fact that I'm wearing this brand, that's kind of me showing my allegiance. So, stores and especially like really fancy like D2C stores are kind of like fourth temple, right? It's like this is what's meaningful, right? Is like come in and have this beautiful aesthetic experience. Um, those are some things that come to mind. There's things that are a little bit deeper, like, you know, ayahuasca ceremonies and whatnot, but I think those are actually approximating something more like a fifth, getting closer to a fifth temple than just the obsession with surfaces that the fourth temple has.
So how are you measuring what if a temple is third, fourth, or fifth? Is it via the net culture that you sense? Is it about each individual's consciousness within that experience? Is it about the leaders who are putting on that and the intention that they're creating? Because I could
Right.
see basically people at that are sort of operating from a center of gravity in each of these different temples going to an ayahuasca ceremony, but they're all there for different reasons. So then it's
Yeah.
hard to define that as X, Y, or Z unless maybe the creators of that specific ceremony are holding it with an intentionality that has more of a fourth or fifth temple quality to it.
I think that's a really great point. I think that's kind of where this gets a little bit muddy, um, especially because we're in a time in history which is kind of unique, I guess, in the relatively to the rest of human history where um, you can just like sign up for something and go to it and then come back to your daily life. Like back in the day, people weren't just getting initiated into like plant medicine lineages like willy-nilly or like initiated into like esoteric religious traditions or whatever it was willy-nilly. That would have been part of something and you would have had to go through initiations and grades to get there. So that's it's a little bit easier to look at that and say, well, that's exactly what it is. Whereas now it's like you said, you can come from any perspective and have an experience of any other perspective. And so it's kind of all over the place. I would say in general, the way I'm looking at it is what is the main narrative that's alive in this container or in this place? Is this about you know, achieving something, developing yourself and innovating and creating something new, the entrepreneurial mindset, right? Is it about success and achievement and material success? That would be kind of the third temple. Is it about, connecting to others, connecting to earth, connecting to oneself, like, kind of more holistic healing? Is it about just kind of open-ended personal individual exploration? That would be more like the fourth temple sort of thing. Is it about like following a specific code? Would be more second temple.
So, well, let's talk about the fifth temple. What do you like sort of just when you allow that quality of consciousness to imbue your being, what arises?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is the word cohesion. And like there's a lot of words of that nature that are arising, like intentionality, cohesion, um, buy-in, like transformation, coordination, integration of disparate things into a new whole. I think the flavor of the fifth temple to me is like you have, I can almost describe it because we've been doing some of these experiences at the house. It's like you have all these people that are very unique and special, kind of like they it is arising out of the fourth temple, right? So the fourth temple allows you to break from one linear narrative of success, right? And the fourth temple says you can follow your passion, you can be unique in your own way, and that's enough, right? I guess if you can make money off of it, kind of in because we're still in third temple world, but ideally it would be it's enough to just be you, right? Just be you, live your own truth. So it's people who have kind of found their thing, like kind of found their truth and are to some degree actualized in their authenticity, coming together to participate in something that is bigger than them. So, often you see like Fourth Temple ads, and it's like you have people of different, like, body constitutions and different outfits and different races, like all posing together. And it's like, wow, like inclusion, right? And I think the difference between the Fourth Temple and the Fifth Temple is the Fifth Temple is not just inclusion, but also integration. Like, okay, we're all here, but what are we doing? And I think like a snapshot of the Fifth Temple would be like, or an advertisement for the Fifth Temple would be showing some some cohesive unfolding, like a ritual unfolding or a ceremony unfolding, or just even the way a meal is cooked, and the fact that there are all these different moving pieces that are collaborating to something, but bringing in these different perspectives. So, I think the Fifth Temple reintroduces lineage, it reintroduces responsibility, um, it reintroduces a recognition of, or it, I guess, systematizes a recognition of the different parts of us. In the fourth temple, you have this idea that we have different parts, but they're kind of able to do their own things irrespective of each other. In the fifth temple, at least the way that I think of it, like let's just take my system, you have kind of these seven life domains that you're trying to keep in order. So you have your physical health, you have your kind of passions, you have your goals, your practical goals, you have your relationships, you have your expression, you have your knowledge or your kind of cognitive capacity, and you have your connection to something bigger than you. And the idea um, is that these things are being harmonized. And so I don't think you would actually see a huge variation in like, body weight. I think everyone would be trying to take active care of their health, and we would have a culture of health and of physical health as being something that we all really care about. I think you would see people wearing things that seem very unique and specific to them, things that make them feel like themselves, and they feel like they're embodying their kind of um, their aesthetic story, and they've taken time to investigate that and explore that. You would see, um, every layer. I could go through every layer, but every layer is essentially online, and there's a community that's living in this holistic way. And so I think, Fifth Temple things kind of look like, might look something like a co-living community or regenerative community that has culture emerging out of it and rituals and ceremonies, and is hooked into a larger network of other ones doing it with some sort of protocol that's shared across all of them, a very loose protocol that's shared across all of them, and then individual culture in those specific pockets. See a little bit of this at Burning Man. Like there's the 10 principles that everyone follows, and then each camp has like a really unique, rich culture. And I think we would see that in the fifth temple is like you actually get, like, you keep the subculture thing of the fourth temple, but the subcultures are uniting into a meta culture that is holding all of them, where there are shared values across all of them, and they actually, are sharing information and resources across them, and are taking time to respect one another and develop a cohesion between each other. And this is why I've created like the archetype wheel and things like this, because you could imagine the subcultures as being like little fractal um, branches coming out of these larger archetypes, and the larger archetypes, synthesize up into the unified one or the unified field or the whole organism. And so from the one or from the, kind of the ground or the wholeness, you get all these different types of wholeness, these different flavors of wholeness. And those step down into subcultures and subcommunities that are living together and working together, but they all are, meeting periodically throughout the month, throughout the year, throughout the many years in and kind of regenerating or investing in a larger cohesion as well.
Yeah.
Kind of all
Beautiful.
over the place, but
No, it's great. Yeah. I've said everything that you've said before to other people, so it's cool to hear my own words back from somebody else and be like, ah, this is nice. And I mean that in a beautiful way of like sensing the collective consciousness that's coming online, and it's coming through Ari in this moment, and it's coming through me in other moments, and we each have our own unique flavor and take on it, and it has, a slightly different um uh poetics to it. Like the sound of it can be slightly different, but it's ultimately harmonizing into a larger story that is arising now, and seems to be turning a lot of people on and creating a lot of aliveness, even just in being and the potentiality of it as it lives through our storytelling.
yeah.
It's almost like we're sitting around the campfire, right now, dreaming up the future, which is creating it's like watering the soil for that future to birth
Hmm.
in more ways than just the sharing of it subtly through our energetic resonance with it. So it's alive and already born, and also yet to exist simultaneously in some sense.
Hmm. Like the dream is kind of coming to a lot of people at the same time, but it hasn't kind of come into manifestation yet. Um, what would you say are some of the things that come to mind for you when you think about what the fifth temple looks like, or however you want to language what it is we're talking about?
Mm. Well, there's an immediate sense of feeling actually, I'm gonna slightly back up and share one thing I wanted to say earlier, which is when you were naming the seven qualities, often there's a very simplistic way that people can relate to developmental theory, which is being like, oh, I'm second tier, or I'm this or whatever. And I think what that's missing is saying, well, which parts of you are this, or which parts of you are that? Because yeah, there's different ways in which like maybe one's aesthetic awareness is at orange, and the relational capacities are more or less hanging out in green territory, unless of course there's contraction, and then one's maybe cognitive capacities are at turquoise, and they're really quite sort of developed and tapped in, and but maybe their sort of waking up line of development is really all over the place because it hasn't yet sort of stabilized, and they're not prioritizing that part of their life. And so there's a way in which creating it's kind of like taking parts work, but then applying it to the development of your individual lines of capacity, and then sensing. And then it's not just about like making all of these lines as high as possible, because that's kind of actually like an achiever perspective towards development, but it's more of relating to each line and tuning in and sensing in and listening into what wants to be prioritized and expressed and developed and nurtured, and how does that change moment by moment, and then also over time through the goals that we set for ourselves, and the relationships that we have um, with the priorities of our life, basically. And so, um, yeah, and then there's a sensing into when is it important to sort of develop over a broad set of capacities and to kind of hit a baseline in enough different developmental capacities in order to kind of show up in the world from an integrated whole place, however that is shining forth through you. And then also to sense into which of those specific lines or areas of one's life feel like they're most soul calling or soul enriching and are pulling you forth in a way that require a certain level of prioritization. And so maybe there are some individuals that just have mastery in a few domains and they're really lacking in other domains, and the collective can be aware of how they're excelling and lacking, and to sort of hold that person in that awareness and create structures that can help support that person, knowing that maybe their life path is truly just to be a monk that is solely focused on awakening and is there a way in which we can hold that person as operating from second tier in some capacities and not from in other capacities, or from fifth temple in some capacities and earlier temples in other capacities, and to have that be okay and to have that be part of actually a fifth temple awareness, is that not everyone needs to be sort of fifth temple across all lines of development. And so it can get quite complex, but also all that complexity can really wash away into just an intuitive sensing and a feeling moment by moment of, um, yeah, it's like once a lot of this stuff is online, it can just kind of fall back into the DNA or the pores of your being and can just be sensed and felt in a much more kind of embodied, um, at the speed of awareness kind of sensing. And then, but everyone has blind spots and shadows and um, projections and whatnot that we're not aware of. And so it's important to, in addition to have maybe some leaders, like you were saying, that are intuitively sensing and kind of helping to um, corral different consciousness in different ways to help the whole, to also have systems of ethics and councils and, like people that are viewing that from an outside perspective and are able to hold what is happening with some checks and balances to ensure that shadow dynamics don't play out, to the extent that they would otherwise. So that's where like some of the system and structure feels really important, and like not spiritually bypassing into this like moment by moment kind of attunement without the actual actualization of that into a broader structural form that can help make this more solidified in a larger context and say just your very close pocket of friends that you're living with. And I think that's when that can begin to happen more wide scale than some of these fifth fifth temple communities like regenerative villages can begin to really arise and then network with other villages, and then they can kind of share their learnings and their wisdoms, like you were saying. And that I think once that, I mean, it is already beginning to happen. I've seen it firsthand, but once that really takes off, it'll be like a bit of a domino effect, I think, where things will start to fall into place quite rapidly. And the external, like physical circumstances of climate change and different systems collapse might exponentially catalyze that process due to a sheer survival necessity that warrants it.
So well said. So much there, and so well said. Um, yeah, like it's sometimes I think of it. I don't know if it's like a masculine feminine thing or the best way to think of it, but it's like we need that sensing in the moment, like you were saying, just like that melting into what's trying to emerge moment to moment, and like having good maps of like generally knowing what we're trying to do or where we're going so that we can coordinate across groups of people. And it's kind of like having both of those things online seems really important. And has been one of the driving, I guess, motivations behind my work is how can I create kind of a minimum viable metaphysics or a minimum viable cultural system that could be adopted by a variety of different subcultures or a variety of different of these regenerative communities, but that there is some sort of spine that all of them share that they can kind of grow around. And, it seems to me that like Wilbur did a pretty good job of getting on some of those metaphysical primitives. And what I've tried to do is kind of fill it in because, when you're trying to be really philosophical, you keep it content free, and you say like, okay, there's lines of development, but like, I don't know how many, or like there's states of consciousness, but like, we don't really know what it looks like, or like there's levels, but you can use whatever level system you want. It's like, you actually kind of got to tack down what we're talking about. So then we actually know how many buildings to build, like how many structures are we building? Was it? Yeah.
I was just gonna, yeah, another way to frame that is to, like at some point you have to reify the thing. And I think it's not about reifying from blindness, but reifying from the view that it's empty, that we are constructing a model that is taking the complexity of everything and minimizing it into, these seven things or this five temples or whatever. And on one level, it's fucking absurd. Like it's just ridiculous. And on another level, how can we minimize all of human experience into, a few hundred or maybe 1,000 English words? Like that's also absurd. And yet we do it because it's useful and it's practical and it's beautiful as well. Like it's also, we can create poetry and music and art through and intimacy and love through language. And we can also do that through maps and stories and narratives. And so can we hold it from, yeah, sort of the awakened awareness view of it being insubstantial, but also vividly appearing as we construct it to appear, and then adapt and allow it to learn from itself. And so I like this phrase came to me just a moment ago where I was like, oh, the Bible of the Fifth Temple has to be digital because it's going to be updated all the time. And so if it's a written, published book, it's too solid of a thing uh to adapt. But it can't be like an iPhone note or something. Like maybe the fourth temple would be or something where it's like where it's so insubstantial that it's lacking sacredness. And so how can it be like a digital Bible where it's malleable and it's flexible and it's constantly being updated, and maybe there's even an AI component that is self-learning for and on behalf of the humans, while also having a like a sacred holiness to it where it's treated with a reverence, and it's not messed with unless it's absolutely necessary in a sense. So holding a lot of these polarities and finding kind of a still point between it, and then allowing the different communities um, to experiment. Like I think when a new consciousness comes online, like the temple is maybe now, it requires a lot of experimentation and a lot of sharing of learnings and insights. And so um, yeah, like I think it's good to let 1,000 flowers bloom, as long as those flowers can coordinate with each other at some point. It's not like they need to the entire time. Sometime it might be important to go into the cocoon for a month or a year or a decade and really just like do your thing, do your experiment. But if there's a way in which you can then share that learning or that wisdom, or allow others to come in and to interpenetrate with your prototyping, uh, yeah, that feels like really important. And then the last thing I'd share is when you were saying philosophy, like Ken Wilber and stuff like this. I think one of the things what we've been talking about prior to recording this was a lot of nerds, are in our community, and love these people, some of my dearest friends, and probably projection because I consider myself nerdy as well. But uh, you're just like writing these like really long, complex, things that have like all these big words in them and stuff, and they're not, there's nothing sexy about it. It's completely void of any aesthetics, of any sexiness, of any artistry, of any creative aliveness in a more kind of like embodied, earthy, sensual way. And I feel like, hold on one second.
Mhm.
That's funny because the person who's calling me reminds me of a lot of the things I was just sharing about in terms of the positive, in terms of the qualities that I would like to bring into the scene. Um, but yeah, so it's like how can like I like how you reframe the fifth temple instead of it being a developmental stage, which sounds super fucking boring and nerdy and academic. Like how can, yeah, we call it begin to bring on language and aesthetics and art and beauty and all that to create something that is transmitting the consciousness of the fifth temple cognitively and in all the other ways of um, receiving information.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. So good. Yeah. Going back to one of the earlier points quickly, just to like stamp that, I so agree. Like we're never in language or in conceptual in our conceptual minds going to be able to like actually understand the mystery of what is going on, or even be able to shuttle what we're experiencing in higher states down into conceptual language in any way that doesn't do insane violence to it. Right. Like how can what you put a river in like a Tupperware and then you like ship it somewhere, like that's not the river, right? Like that's a you know what I'm saying. So I totally agree with that. And, you know, we have this conceptual mind. We use it to do things. We need to coordinate. We are speaking in language, which means we've already kind of surrendered to this. Might as well pick the best language. Might as well tell the most beautiful stories. If we're going to be mired in stories, if we're going to have to tell stories at some point, might as well choose from that state of awakened wholeness and from the understanding that it's all empty and that it's all, kind of a joke compared to the real thing. How can we actually pick the most beautiful story that makes the most sense to every layer of us? And I'll just leave a bookmark to discuss that more in the future, either on this call or later, with why I'm transitioning to a cosmology that's kind of tree based, or there's like the major image is a tree, and that's because human beings are descended from mammals, and mammals are from the trees. We were burrowing around and in trees and living in trees during the time of the dinosaurs, and then our specific lineage is also the primate lineage, which is adapted for the trees, and that's why we have thumbs is to wrap around a tree branch, and why like most of the stuff in our society is like a weird like truncated branch. Like a handle is just like a branch. Like a sword is like a branch with like a sharp thing. Like everything around us is like a branch and we don't even really think of it. Like trees are so deeply within us and within our in our subconscious. There's something about using the images that hook into our subconscious mind, right? Like the concept of a mother and a father, like that just resonates with all mammals and certainly resonates like with humans, right? The concept of like trees or the concept of a tribe and different archetypes, these sorts of things, we have this in our deep structures. Might as well tell a story that is consonant with those deep structures or integrates those deep structures so that we can be using the most amount of our capacity. And so that's one of the kind of design constraints that I'm thinking of as I'm trying to create new stories is how do we hook into the biggest amount of our, you know, layered mind.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, this one of the to one of the later points you made, this idea, of like some sort of shared protocol that is very loose that allows these individual kind of units or communities to experiment, but we also are like on a regular interval meeting together or sharing things. And I think that's really one of the things that would differentiate a fifth temple from a fourth temple because the fourth temple did have its commune moment, right? And did have its like community moment, but they were all in isolation and they weren't talking to one another and they weren't trying to coalesce into something bigger. They were just trying to divest from the modernist structure. And I think this time it's like we recognize there's value in containers and there's value in small experiences and small experiments, and we also want those to integrate into something. And so something I'd be interested to continue to talk about and continue to noodle on and that I've been thinking about with Brendan, Graham Dempsey, and with Layman Pascal is like, what's the minimum protocol that would be shared by people pursuing a project like this or an experiment like this? It's kind of an interesting question.
Mhm.
Um, I'm forgetting there was a point I wanted to make with the last thing you said, but uh, forgetting now.
I just wanted to share that when I was in college, I studied photojournalism and documentary filmmaking, and I was reading this book. I'm forgetting the name of it. I still have it somewhere, and it's basically about how to manipulate the brain in order to pay attention to films when you're editing. So it's an editing book, and it's called like In the Blink of an Eye, I think it is, and it's all about like using people's fear receptors of thinking that like a lion might be coming for them in the jungle to edit in certain ways that create like contrasting visuals at a certain pace in order to hook the brain and to keep it captivated on the content. And yeah, I really that book was very impactful for me. It was a psychology book, and I ended up using that to sell products and advertising in in the third temple, and to kind of as well as tell stories for nonprofits and political leaders as well. When I was in the fourth temple, I also did some stuff for like Bernie Sanders and whatnot that was like using a lot of those types of editing techniques. And it's just interesting that now what you're talking about is kind of like conscious manipulation from like a fifth temple perspective to create transformation of the human psyche and the collective consciousness. And yeah, so it's just an example of how particular ways manipulating essentially like it's essentially what it is like having an effect to change somebody in a way that is trying to move our desire or our stated goal or vision forward, and just how that can grow up through these different temples as well.
Yeah, one of the like quips that Luca, my roommate and collaborator, and I sometimes say is like, the fifth temple reintroduces sugar. Like the fourth temple is afraid of sugar, right? Or doesn't like sugar on a spiritual basis, or like on like a deep um meta like narrative, just doesn't like sugar. It wants things to be natural, organic, like the way that they kind of originally are, and doesn't want added sugar. And that is part of what makes the fourth temple not that sexy, right? To like people who aren't fourth temple, who don't respect organicness for its own sake, who are like, wait, why should I come hang out with you if I just have to eat like banana chips and like, wear like linen all the time or whatever? Like I can't wear my like rock star outfit. I can't like do the cool, sexy thing. And I think one of the, I guess, benefits that we have from the fifth temple is we have a case for we can integrate sugar because it has a place in our metaphysical framework. It has a place in our spiritual disposition. We recognize that sexiness, um, aesthetic, I guess, excellence is part of what makes life beautiful. And we have a desire to have beauty as being a part of life and to invest resources in that direction. And so, from like I guess you could say a marketing perspective, it also helps in that the stuff that we make can from like a doctrinally okay perspective, like a ethically consistent perspective, it can and it could and should be aesthetically sexy, and we can use a bit more of um, that sugar that is a part of our experience, or we can share some of the sugar that is a part of our experience. The sexiness of life can be more a part of our
Yeah.
transmission.
Yeah. I wrote a whole essay that I never published, but I was proud of it. It was called Healthy Hedonism. And it was just kind of mapping out my way of moving through hedonism, where there's sort of unconscious hedonism, which is kind of coming through different shadow parts. And it's kind of a form of escapism that we don't necessarily have control over. And then there's the antithesis of hedonism, which is, not going into parties and, stopping caffeine and not doing any drugs or whatever, and kind of like taking everything a little bit too seriously, which is definitely a phase that I went through. And
Oh,
then
cool.
there's like conscious hedonism on the other side, which is going to, say, a concert for no other reason other than to go to the concert, but doing that because you recognize in the long arc of your life that those types of moments are important and have value, and they have meaning. Even the meaninglessness of it has meaning in a sort of a net way, when you can integrate that into like a conscious escape or and even with drugs, it's like if you can um yeah, choose consciously to have an experience where you are sort of going into the experience fully as a way of being present with that experience for the sake of exploration or for the sake of fun or novelty or connection with friends. Um, but also doing so in a way that is sort of aware of your choice making in the moment and is contextualizing that choice making into a broader orientation towards how one is living their life intentionally, then yeah, I feel like that's I think that can happen in the fourth temple as well. It's not like specific to the fifth temple necessarily, but Jamie Wheel talks a lot about that with I think he has something like he has like a calendar. I'm forgetting what he's calling it. Like, what do you remember what it's called?
Is it the hedonic calendar?
Yeah, the hedonic calendar. Yeah, yeah. Of basically integrating moments of peak experiences into your life and on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, monthly basis, seasonally and annually, and having those be different intensities of peak experiences.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that's those are kind of examples of like fifth temple things. And one thing I wanted to share when I was poking fun, I hope it came off as that at like nerds that are just writing the philosophy and lacking. I don't think that they need to change. Like I think that they're doing such a gift and a service, and I think maybe what I'm pointing to is feeling like, oh, my role can come. Like I'm not into philosophy, and I never wanted to read, books about Hegel and all this stuff, and so. Um, I'm so glad that other people are doing that. And then I can kind of take the wisdom from them and then bring my background in photography and storytelling and more of my aesthetic visual nature and kind of integrate those two. And that's what the purpose of a collective is, and also a network is that each of us can find our place of mastery and our place of soul calling and to fully express that, knowing that others in the collective will attune to our gifts and be able to um like the more I can fully be myself, the more someone else can fully be themselves because we can meet and attune to each other and like serve each other and each other's need points essentially, and then that can kind of scale collectively and into a network and then even broader. And so there's a way, but there's a level of conformity that's also required in that. And that's what I was thinking about with aesthetics is like, what if people are just like, they don't care about, like, I don't really like Halloween, to be honest. I never liked Halloween. I always felt a lot of pressure to dress up and have to like do something that would just make everyone else happy. But for me, it didn't really bring me a lot of joy. I would rather sit with somebody and have a cup of tea and really go deep in conversation like we are right now, for example, than to kind of be at a party where everyone's face is covered and you can't really even connect to people and there's this loud music playing and everyone's just sitting there and like drinking, their alcohol and then eating candy and like crashing at the end of the night. And so for me, like Halloween was never that fun of a holiday. But I also recognize that like conforming to traditions are important, and there's a way in which like when if you go to Burning Man and just wear gym shorts and a t-shirt, then you're harming the collective in a sense, in a subtle way, in an energetic way, and in a visual way. And so how can like those operating from fifth temple consciousness and fifth temple collectives attune to when they are expressing their individuality in a way that is important for them to sort of not conform because by not conforming, they can take that energy that they would be spending on conforming and bringing it into their deepest, fullest, masterful expression in the world. And then how can one sense like, no, this is actually important and this is kind of um, staying true to a deeper principle that I've given myself to and sort of like devoted my being to that requires me to do something that's outside of my comfort zone, that's inconvenient for me, that's asking me to show up in a way that might not personally bring me joy on a surface level, but there's a deeper joy of being able to relate to others in a from a deep principled perspective that is so much more richer in the long run.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it makes me think of something, Skylar, the first thing you said about, you don't need the nerds to change, you just want to add the others to the mix. It makes me think of something Skylar Brown said at the Metamodern Spirituality Lab in Vermont, which is like, the lab's theme was on the goddess, and we were talking about like how do you get the goddess into this space? And one of the things she said is like, you kind of have to like make space for her. Like you have to like make it look nice for her. Like you got to dress the place up for her. Like she's not just gonna like walk into some shack and like
Yeah.
give a sermon. Like, she needs to feel invited in and taken care of and given a hospitable experience. And I think the same thing is true for the aesthetic people, and for the artists and for the creatives. It's like when I go to Icon, it's like I don't there's no place for them. Like there's a place for people who've read Hegel. You can fit right in. And if you are that person, you're going to come there and you're going to feel at home. But like, a lot of old magical rituals are about like creating the container such that the thing is like inevitable to happen,
Yeah.
right? Like trying to almost set everything else up except the thing so that the thing like has to emerge because like all its like preconditions are there, right? And it's like I think we should think about like summoning other, in the same way we think about like summoning a demon or summoning an angel or whatever, we should think about like summoning the people we want as a part of the movement. It's like you kind of have to make an aesthetic offering to attract an aesthetic person. There has to be something for them to do, something for them to hook into, something for them to be inspired by or wowed by, for them to decide to take the time and energy and money to show up to something. And we're just not making that effort. There's just no kind of foothold for them. And I think part of this is, you know, by telling a story in which their seat is there and their seat is vacant. Um, and I think our current story that we tell in some of these communities, I mean, it's the story of great thinkers, usually men, who are, locking themselves in a cabin and coming up with some amazing idea that's going to change the world, right? Whether it's Ken or whether it's Hansi Freinacht, kind of joking about that story and saying he's in the Swiss Alps, but realistically, that's what Daniel Gortz is doing. Like, he also is doing that. It's like sincerely ironic, right? Like he is alone in some room writing away, his magnum opus. And that only attracts a certain type of person if our story as a culture is more about um, the philosophers come first, right? Because they're kind of tracking this from a cognitive perspective. And this thing happened, the way I tell the story is every every temple kind of has like a three-part emergence. The first thing is it starts to be noted. Well, the first thing is that there's some breakthrough in a field that makes that perspective possible. So, in the scientific revolution, it was like a scientific breakthrough, right? That like made that possible. They're actually coming to new realizations about how the earth works. In the fourth temple, they're um, we're actually having revelations about the ills of modernity, and we're having revelations about toxins in our bloodstream because of chemicals, and we're seeing the atomic bomb drop. Like there's something active that's changing that people are aware of. Then like so a new reality kind of opens up. Then usually the philosophers are the first ones to interpret what this means, right?
Mhm.
They're the first ones to say, okay, given this new information that we have, this is how we should be thinking about it, right? So in the third temple, you have the initial scientists like, Newton and someone like Newton, let's say, or Copernicus or Galileo. And then you have the people a couple hundred years later or 100 years later, like, Rousseau and Immanuel Kant and Descartes and these various people that are talking about the like philosophical results of living in a rational universe and how we should live given that we live in a rational universe. In the same way, in the fourth temple, you have these things that are happening and are being discovered. And then you have people like Foucault and Derrida who are saying what this means, like what multi-perspectivalism means and what postmodernism means. And they're kind of outlining the philosophical understanding, right? But then what happens after that is you get basically a movement of artists who are being inspired by the philosophy in one way or another and are putting it into artistic forms. And then you get the masses are responding actually to the artistic production and they're being brought into the culture through the artistic production. And that's kind of what you see, like, the Beatles are getting like very esoteric. stuff from Mahesh Yogi, or they're getting stuff downstream from these ideas of multi-perspectivalism through psychedelics, through Tim Leary, etc. And then it's coming out in their music, which is kind of palatable to everyone. And all you have to do as a person is sing "All You Need Is Love," or like, Imagine, and you're kind of in the fourth temple. You don't have to read, the existentialists. And so we're kind of just early in the movement where we have we've had the breakthroughs, the scientific breakthroughs with regards to complexity science and new understandings of evolution, and new understandings of thermodynamics, all the things that are the basis scientifically of the fifth temple's view of reality. And now we've had the philosophers come, right? But it's actually time, I think, for us to transition from the philosophers to the artists. And I see people like myself and yourself, kind of the younger generation, millennial, zillennial, Gen Z, as
So I know.
being millennial Zoomers. Um, I mean, literally on Zoom right now, but being the kind of the bridge
Yeah.
um, between the philosophers and the artists.
Yeah, 100%. So just if people are, are listening to this, Ari and I met at ICON, which is the Integral Conference of North America. And yeah, it was a beautiful conference. I think everyone really enjoyed themselves. And I read a lot of the feedback forms because I was on part of the committee for that. And yeah, I would say it was a net success. And it was I would call it an abomination, if I can use that word, when it comes to beauty and aesthetics and transmission. And well, there was some transmission, but it was like the transmission was coming from individual humans. It wasn't coming the the environmental being. And so I think that's part of the fifth temple is seeing all of reality as our collective. And so seeing our table and um, empty awareness and the tea that we're drinking and the shirt that we're wearing, and the energy that's moving through the space and each person's thoughts and all like everything is alive and awake and interrelating and connecting and kissing each other. And
Mhm.
so how do we create gatherings and communities and lives that are based in a consciousness that can hold everything as being. It's kind of like a return to animism, but from maybe a transpersonal lens that is ultimately non-dual, including duality as part of the non-dual expression of itself. So there's all of that, and I'm working very hard on doing that for the next icon because I'm on the committee again. But then moving into the art piece, the reason why Ari and I have started to talk is because we're connecting on what would it be like to create a film that is a transmission of the fifth temple, a story birthed from and as the fifth temple, that is a lighthouse, a beacon, an invitation into a state experience that is a felt sense of the more beautiful world of this fifth temple potential. And we have just found a lot of resonance and excitement speaking with each other about the possibilities of that. And so this call is kind of part of the tuning into and listening from and as this sort of potentiality as it's kind of it feels like it's kind of like a ping pong ball that's just sort of like bouncing around all over the place. And yeah, maybe the question that feels worth asking now is what does a film or a piece of art, what are the features or characteristics of a Fifth Temple artwork? Um, and one of the things that I would say, and maybe postmodernism begins to do this, but is to break 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 the boundaries of the medium a bit. And
Totally.
so one of the reasons why I left film about 5 years ago is because I wanted to I got to this place where I felt like people would watch a documentary about something that's happening in the world, and then it would at the end it would say like, donate to this nonprofit, but basically, and then like roll credits, and there's basically nothing to really do other than to just be consumed by the horrible or inspiring event that's happening. But still, it was like a very passive experience, and I had this feeling of like, well, can we actually create this new world instead of just making documentaries that talk about how important it is to create this new world? And so then I started visiting different intentional communities and eco villages and different sanghas and plant medicine, communities and places where the transmission of a new flavor of consciousness was an experiential story that people could actually go to and live there, the living story that they get to be a part of. They get to be the actor, but also the director in some ways, and also to be in the mystery of its unfolding. And just like when you're watching a movie at a movie theater, you don't know what's going to happen next. And just like when you're going into a transformational experience, you're in the flow of the mystery, and also you have agency as the character in that film, and also you are part of a larger story that is beyond what the character might be aware of in that particular narrative. And so it was almost like I just broke the boundaries of filmmaking and saw all of life as an unfolding film, and awareness itself is the canvas that is God is directing moment by moment, and I get to be sort of both the character, the person watching the film, and to some extent the person directing the film simultaneously. And now there's kind of a returning back to the medium of film as a particular aesthetic and transmission vehicle that is popular in our culture and more accessible than ever via digital technology and even AI right now, and a way to, yeah, transmit to a large scale audience, or not even a large scale, but just to people that I'm not physically connected with. And also it's beautiful. It's like it's a way, it can be a form of art that can create beauty and joy and love and connection. And so, yeah, I'm gonna stop.
Yeah, I mean, first thing that comes up is I just hearing it again gets me excited again. But I loved your vision, and I love this project, and I love this way of thinking about it. And it's something that I would love. That's why I'm here. But I think it's something we need, and that um, an artistic, aesthetic transmission of the actual state, the fifth temple state, not just like, here's what's happening, like, hope you'll join us, donate at the link, as opposed to like, no, actually, this is what it feels like to be in this state of consciousness. And you can experience it right now with us in this movie. Like, we're not pointing at something out there. We're giving you an experience right here of this thing. And I think that's a really powerful way to think about it. And I just love that idea of the movie metaphor. I think um, that is actually a big part of my own personal cosmology, which I've maybe shared a little bit of online, but I'm gonna be sharing more of, which is I actually call, the layer right before I guess complete unity consciousness. I call that the directors, and this idea that there really are these directors that are, I mean, in other traditions they might call them archangels or something, but the kind of the personal aspects of the Godhead are kind of these like kind of trickstery director guys who are throwing you these situations to see how you're going to react to it. And then you're, of course, a director of a smaller, order of consciousness, I guess, and you're directing your own life moment to moment. And then they're doing these big world events. And so I love that idea. And it makes me think, I wonder what we can do in the context of the movie, like playing with that, like playing with like the fractal storytelling of like the person who's watching it in that moment, us creating the movie, God creating everything all the time, every moment.
I thought of this, gosh, maybe 3.5 or 4 years ago, but because I've been different versions of this film have been dreaming itself through me for a while. And so one example is to have the film. like to film to basically project the film in a movie theater and then to film the film playing in a movie theater, but then the camera pulls back to reveal the movie theater. So you create this kind of hollow mirrors effect. And I have notes about why I would do that, and I'm forgetting in the moment, but there was like a way of basically creating kind of a witness consciousness type of effect through going meta on the film by literally going meta on the actual literal film and the experience of watching the film and like creating that state experience through a visual holonic trickery essentially. Yeah, so this is one little thing.
That reminds me of that scene in Inside where Bo Burnham is like reflecting, like he does like a review of something and then he like reflects on the review and then he reflects on the reflect on the review. You know, like it's
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. Yeah,
something like that. I think something about that strikes me as very Fifth Temple. Like, um,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Well, I think also, yeah, what yeah, maybe this isn't true for all of the Fifth Temple, but for the qualities of the Fifth Temple that I feel most attracted to is it's less about getting somewhere and it's more about being the thing that we desire to experience, quote unquote, in the future now. And so it's like pulling the future into the now and then being the birthing of the future as a now that is just unfolding itself. Um, and what that does for me experientially is that I think it keeps me more connected to the intimacy of just like pure kind of tactile, experiential, moment to moment awareness. Um, and it creates a sense of faith that is so close that the faith loses its meaning because faith is almost still there's like a duality in faith where it's like a belief of
right.
something, but it's kind of like a capital F faith that sort of permeates everything in a way. And so it's like the feeling of home imbues the feeling of not being at home, and it can hold
Yeah,
that feeling of
yeah,
not being at home in a larger homeness that can help to um, float it to its relative feeling of home through the very being in a larger kind of felt sense of home. Um, and yeah, I wonder how a film can communicate that both in words, but more so maybe in the music and in the pacing and in the symphonic, like the symphony, the jazz of the different visual elements that kind of come together to create something that, like you're saying, is maybe playing into our deep psychic structures that make us feel at home, only to have that state experience of realizing we were already at home, even when we're not at home, and kind of creating that unitive experiential sense. And then the film can also do that from a maybe a visual sense. There's like a harmonization of the aesthetic and musical and editorial qualities of the filmmaking process that replicate the like upper left quadrant state experience, you could say.
I mean, insane. The poetry, I mean, when you were saying the capital F faith that like everything else is kind of resting in and that capital F faith allowing you to go through the transmutation process that actually results in like the relative home or like the capital H home that like when you actually rest on the capital H home, you can metabolize getting thrown out of the relative lowercase h feeling of home, right?
Yeah. And that's like one possibility. And another possibility is it doesn't even really matter anymore that you don't feel at home because there's like a deep faith that that is what is necessary to feel in this moment. And then the only thing to do is just fully feel it until it moves on its own. And whether that's a minute or a day or a year. It's kind of it's not that there's not, it's not that it's totally passive. You just sit there like in a coma and you just let it pass, but you fully go into it and then you listen to it and you're with it and you have intimacy with it and you create a relationship with it. And then the wisdom of that relationship unfolds itself, which is kind of what we're doing here with the film. Um,
Yeah.
but it can be easy. I think this is why my trip to Ukraine was helpful because it can be easy to just keep basking in either the philosophy of it or the spiritual state experience of it or the kind of like feel goody experience of it and to not actually actualize the thing on a concrete level. And again, I feel like that's why sometimes the meta crisis or the concrete um need for survival is can be really helpful because it can force the hand of somebody to actualize what might be quite um solidified in them on a subtle level or even like a causal sort of deeper soul or level, but when there's like a physical survival at stake, it can sometimes like force that to ground itself and embody itself and it becomes more deeply structured in our being. And I think that from a long arc perspective, there can be something very helpful in that
Yeah.
journey that is important.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, so well said. I'm really glad you had that Ukraine experience. I think that's like it's so interesting to hear. I would really have never expected it. Maybe we go into that another time, but just so exciting. Part of me that part where you were saying the part of the fifth temple that really resonates with you is like embodying that future potential now. It makes me think like if one like wrapper around the show or around the movie was like in some ways simulating like okay we succeeded like the fifth temple has emerged, we're living in this way a good or like we've subverted the meta crisis, humanity has made it to the other side, the fifth temple is alive and well, like humanity is alive and well, the ecosystem is alive and well. How did we do it? And we're like time traveling back to talk to like the people that did it or like the people that it were influential in its being done and like interviewing them in kind of like a different way than we would interview them normally, which is like, hey, what are your thoughts? What are you thinking about? Like, what is your work? And being like, how did you slash how did you solve the meta crisis? Like, how did we do it as a species? And them like telling their stories, something I don't know,
This
something like
film,
that.
I will tell you, dear, in this film already exists. What's the guy, Peter, what's his face? What?
Peter Lindbergh?
No, Peter, he created a series of movies that have existed for a while. It's really famous. Zeitgeist. Do you know the Zeitgeist series?
No, I don't think I do. Like where they show like clips of every like the zeitgeist of every year.
I don't know. I saw it a long ass time ago. Like it came out when I was in high school, I think. But there's been a series of like his name is Peter something, and his most recent film, which came out a couple years ago, is exactly this. It's like interviewing these. I'll send it to you. I thought it was very well done. It's so long, and it's like way too long. But I thought it was really really cool. There's some really innovative film approaches, and definitely was an inspiration on a film level. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, I love that idea.
Yeah. Like speaking from the future in a way.
Yeah,
Or
yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm curious, but maybe just to close, is there anything else about the Fifth Temple in your cosmology of it as it's sort of come through you that feels like it's been unspoken, or that feels really exciting, or that feels like questions or places of inquiry that you're studying or sensing into?
yeah. Um, I mean, I think once you kind of understand the big pitch of like what the fifth temple is, like a lot of these questions that we've been wrangling with in our conversation come up, which is like, okay, what's the balance between autonomy and conformity, right? Like that you mentioned, like conforming to the Halloween thing or not. You start to get this sense of like we're missing things in the movement, like we're missing the aesthetic people. We have too many of the nerds, like da da da. And to me, like those questions are really solved in a way, or I've been working on the answer to a lot of those questions for the past few years, which is this kind of system that I've made. And so I guess I'm just feeling the impulse to, or the excitement I have around sharing more of that, because I feel like it has some of these answers that if we can get on the same page that like we want to have some sort of integrated society that, is also decentralized but also integrated, it's kind of paradox. I think what arises out of that is, well, we need some sort of very minimal map that we can all agree on that can help us cohere, that, like you said, is reified and is a beautiful story. And that really has been my dharma, and really has been like kind of the thing that I've been tracking over the past few years. And so I guess I'm just feeling the excitement to share like my type system and my intelligence system and these sorts of things, because you can use that language to explain like we're missing the, what I would call like I2 people, the aesthetic intelligence people, like we're over dominant with like the I6, like cognitive people, it's like we're missing some of the the fall time types, like we're missing some of the Western types of the wheel, like we're missing the darkness, we're missing the spookiness. Like it's easy to talk about that when you have the maps. And it's also, I think, easy to think about how we would start to build, a fifth temple festival or a fifth temple ceremony of some kind. When you have a map that everyone's on board with, you say, okay, there are 12 archetypes. We put them in the festival grounds like this, and people come in and they understand, they do some sort of selection thing where they understand what archetype they resonate the most with, and they go hang out in that temple, and they, change into that outfit, and they get trained in that lineage for, a workshop or whatever. And then we come together as a community. Like once you have a map, it's pretty easy to start to think about, okay, how would we actually animate this into life? So, I guess that to, yeah,
Oh no, I was just gonna say, one of the challenges that I see in the liminal web is that it's so decentralized and there's a lot of parallel playing where everyone's creating their own map. And um, I think we
yeah,
were also become quite picky. I'm just totally me speaking about myself here. But I imagine it applies to others is that, it's like, unless it's perfect, unless it like fully resonates with me, then like, nah, like it's cool and all, but I think I'm gonna make my own. And so how do we get out of that hyper individuality of maybe postmodernism where we all have our own truth, our own kind of like our own mini universe that we live in, and to begin to let go into something that is not perfect, but is perfect enough to create from, and knowing that we can adapt it and evolve it, and that it's not going to be held on too tightly by, an authority or, guru type person, and it can be kind of collective. It can be maybe transmitted through the consciousness of a single source, but then that source can sort of let it go into a larger whole that can live it and practice it and evolve it. And there can be, structures and protocols for how it's changed and evolved, um, but to allow for that adaptability over time, but also just to reprogram the human experience that we if we all just tried to individually strive towards our unique utopia, then we're probably all going to be left unsatisfied at the end.
yeah, so well said. I think this is really one of the major hurdles we're facing in the Fifth Temple community, is like the Fifth Temple perspective, or the fifth person perspective, often results in like map making to like integrate these various perspectives. But um so we have a bunch of amazing maps, but they're all kind of unintelligible. Like, to even get spun up on Integral takes a while. Like it's hard to even convince my friends to like get spun up on Ken's work, not to mention Brendan's work, not to mention Greg Henriquez's work, not to mention, Steve McIntosh. Like there's just so many of these individual maps. Um, And so that, and I found myself kind of falling into that my own trap as well. And like, there's ego in it of like, oh, well, I want to say my piece. And like, I have these unique ideas that I want to share. And I think part of that's important. And I think, like you said, we need to transcend that if we're actually going to make this happen. And to me, the solution seems to be like just like being together in person or in constant, I guess, digital communication to the point where that which actually is helpful for us and works for us, like we just use that as opposed to like being in our rooms trying to create the perfect thing and then hoping one day someone will take the like year it takes to like integrate that body of knowledge, like actually being like, okay, what are we trying to do? Let's show up to that. And the maps and the tools that help us make that happen, let's just use those and like use what kind of indigenously emerges as we're trying to do what we're trying to do.
Yeah. I just had an insight, which is that basically the solution to this problem that we're facing, which I think is exacerbated by digital technology because we're not physically in proximity with each other. But I think the one of the solutions for this is friendship. It's like when you love somebody enough that your friendship, your relationship with them trumps your sort of relative disagreements about your various maps or whatever. And it's like the incentive to harmonize your stories or meaning making structures or maps or models or whatever becomes so much more um, important when it's preserving a friendship in the process and is creating depth of intimacy over time. And I've seen this happen where I've invited people to the constructing consciousness gatherings I've done, and like, I don't know, I'm kind of like skeptical of stages or whatever. And I'm like, it's okay, like, who cares? It's not really about stages. It's about hanging out in the hot tub and enjoying each other's company. And then they come and then they fall in love with, the people and they deepen the friendships. And all of a sudden, it was like a month later, they're talking about stages all the time. I'm like, I thought you were all skeptical of stages. And it's like, it just happened naturally because the friendships brought people back.
Totally. That's so well said. Yeah, like I think part of the like model making thing too is like in an individualistic culture, it's like how do you win renown or like how do you win intimacy or win love? It's like, well, I'm gonna make this beautiful thing in my cave and then like put it out to the world and then people will love me. It's like if you actually already feel loved, if you already feel part of a community, like you never need to go like so deep into the like making your diorama perfect because you're already loved, you're already in community, you already have the end goal you're looking for, which is like intimacy and relationship and community and a healthy lifestyle. You actually like, there's actually kind of an 80/20 for, I think, a lot of these frameworks,
Yeah.
you know? Um, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would love to have you back on to talk about the typologies and the other parts of your system because yeah, it's all very fascinating to me. And yeah, I feel a particular resonance with some of the languaging that you use as well. And I find you to be very articulate and able to convey enough complexity, but with a simplicity and a easefulness of language that doesn't require a high barrier of entry. So I think that you're onto something really awesome. So thanks for being on.
Thanks, Tucker. Yeah, this was a real treat.
Yeah.
Wait for more.